My name is John Clevenger. I'm with MIT, the Media Lab, and a nonprofit called IDCube that deals a lot with the whole issue of privacy, security, and data sharing. And we have a fantastic panel collected today. We have 7 members of the panel, and that's the good news. And the bad news is that we only have an hour, 15 minutes. So it means we're going to have to be very stingy about time and enforce time, hoping that people keep to the schedule. I'd like to preface this panel with a certain number of comments, and that is that cybersecurity is becoming an increasingly important and visible issue around the world. And with that there's a new kind of warfare that you want to see with the evidence of the Stuxnet worm, Flame, and that has become an important vehicle for not only nation states but other global actors in order to assert their will. And it's really sort of changed the rules of the game. It's required a new kind of thinking. When you think of something like Stuxnet, which is a worm that's designed in a sense with a warhead that can roam freely, the whole concepts of being able to contain something and being able to identify where it came from, all these things become much more problematic, to the point where there are a lot of people arguing that you have to have a tighter rein on the internet, that you're going to need to have some kind of global governance. And so there are those that will argue that through the ITU and some other mechanisms that there should be a sort of a global governance of the net. Even in the U.S., there's a lot of controversy around being able to have legislation in place that helps the U.S. respond to government to have a more forceful role in enforcing cybersecurity and requiring sort of the private sector to conform in ways that has been highly resisted. So it's a huge challenge, and I think it's a challenge in how to rethink the trade-offs between having security as a nation state, but then also how do you preserve the individual rights of people's freedoms. And the wonderful thing about the net is it's free and open, or it was, or it started out, and that there is that. How do you keep that openness and the interconnectivity without sort of clamping it down and having it sort of fall prey to some of the other institutional forces that have sort of inhibited a lot of innovation and then the creativity. So what I'd like to do is have each of our panel members sort of introduce themselves. I'll give them 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. Recognizing we really do not have a lot of time, we'd like to have another iteration. We'd like to also have the participation of the audience. But briefly introduce themselves and sort of pull out 1 or 2 topics that they feel very strongly about in discourse, so we can then continue the conversation. So Michael.
Thank you, John. So Michael Furtick, I'm the CEO and founder of Reputation.com. We protect reputation and privacy now in over 100 countries. I'm also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the Future of the Internet, which is an awesome title. Last year we were called the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Internet Security and have now upgraded, apparently. Very involved in cybersecurity questions from global scale to micro scale. The thing that I think I can contribute most about to this panel is discussion of individual personal digital security, which we sometimes call privacy. And I'd like to actually offer a very optimistic message about this. Classically, the discussion of privacy has been between 2 combatant parties. One, internet media companies who want to collect information about you and sell it or use it, and then kind of sort of rightsists, on the other hand, who want to stop that somehow and clamp down on it. The good news is that, from my perspective, the good news is that there is a new third way that has emerged in the last few years, globally and locally, with a lot of momentum behind it, which says, hey, look, if we enable individuals to know a lot more about what's being collected about them very transparently, give them clarity on that, give them an opportunity to knowingly trade in the benefit of their information, and then give them a piece very actively of that pie, either through commercial benefit or explicit trade in kind or in cash, or perhaps an explicit trade for free services, even more explicitly than they're getting now, then you actually involve the end user in the governance of his or her data and involve the end user in the monetization of his or her digital DNA. And the reason I think that message is optimistic, it's neither the sort of the party of no, nor is it the party of forget it, definitely yes. It's the party of can we come to some new and different business model for trust and new and different business model for the monetization of data that benefits the innovation of the internet, the openness of the internet, that benefits individuals in a knowing and knowable trade of their data in a very transparent way. So I have a very optimistic message on this topic. My message on cybersecurity, which I think other panelists will also be quite expert in, is somewhat less optimistic, but also I think it's a very interesting topic for us.
I'm Adon Katz. I'm, as noted, the visiting fellow at the Yale Law School on access to knowledge, and last year published a book, Global Flow of Information, which had 2 chapters on information as warfare. In addition, I was doing international policy in cybersecurity for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and now am helping start a collective hackerspace in Oakland with a lot of the Occupy folks. So I am going to, I'd like to represent on the panel the notion that a certain degree of openness rather than closed can actually have benefits in terms of security and privacy as well. And that's something that we've demonstrated and I think goes to the fundamental questions of internet architecture and power and control over the networks. I also am interested particularly in technology and ethics, and the Stuxnet example is one where the intentionality of software, the designers of software, becomes relevant. We've had lots of debates about peer-to-peer, and sort of the ethical responsibility of individuals and the companies. I think in the security context, I think it actually becomes more complicated. So I'd like to contribute when we get to those subjects on that. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Bob Day. Spent the last 3.5 years I have several hats. One is the Chief Information Officer of the United States Coast Guard. The second one I have is as the Director of the Coast Guard Cyber Command, and they're both very different jobs. It's also a unique place for me to be because, one, I report to the DoD side as to U.S. Cyber Command and General Alexander, but at the same time I work within the Department of Homeland Security. So more uniquely than any other agency in government, I get to see both sides of the equation, both the DoD side as well as what's going on for protection and of the whole of government, whole of the nation. In particular, the areas I have emphasis on is maritime critical infrastructure, areas that I don't think that we've really thought through very much, and that's what I'm working on and have been working on over the last couple of years, is to look at the impacts of these types of threats, be it Stuxnet or other ones, to the infrastructure which we think protecting physically was what we're supposed to do, when realistically from a cyber perspective I think there's way much more to be done than from a physical protection standpoint.
Wow, that's big. My name's Michelle Dennedy. Thank you for having me. I'm kind of splitting the panel in half, both in terms of gender as well as specialty areas. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer for McAfee. And so I look after sometimes saying no to my dear friends in government when it looks like the information may be too volatile or we don't have the correct permissions to transfer the information. I'm the one who tries to get to yes, to get the proper weight of intelligence as quickly and efficiently and effectively as possible to the government or other players that require it without compromising the individual who has trusted us with securing their digital environment. I'll just kind of name my 4 horsemen for development. So a chief privacy officer wears many hats. And so I do have a legal background, and so I do play a legal role in working on deals and that sort of thing. But I also have a development role where I work with products and services groups to try to develop the next generation that's going to protect us, not just 5 years from now, but 15 years from now, when all of our borders are liquid, not just the actual ones that Rear Admiral protects for us, but our enterprises are liquid, our schools are liquid, our governments are liquid in terms of information and how they flow. And so I call it the 4 horsemen of development, which is legality, is it legal and where? That's a big problem and a difficult problem to solve. The laws are not harmonized in this area. Is it a commercially viable thing for private industry to go do? I think that is often left off of the equation for the very young companies of viability. So a lot of development in this space to date has stopped there, but I'll add my 2 other horsemen, which is morality and ethics. And because there probably are real ethicists in the audience, I'll give you my hack job how I consider those to be separate entities. Morality, I think, is something that we collectively on the internet decide, if you will, that is right or wrong. There are absolutes. Torturing children, bad. That's immoral. An ethic, well, hopefully it is everywhere. God help us if it's not. That's a whole different panel. But then your ethic is really, it has so much to do with your culture, and your culture is so many concentric circles. So there are companies out there in tech and in every other industry whose ethic is increase the margin, have as fat a margin as possible, and their ethics say that I'm returning value back to my shareholders, and therefore that's ethics. There are others whose ethics are to design something beautiful or design something sustainable. So figuring out for my company what that ethic is very unique to my company, but the 4 horsemen of development and development of systems, not just discrete items within those systems, I think is a universal notion.
I'm Jeff Friedberg. I'm the Chief Trust Architect for Microsoft, and over the last 3 or 4 years been focused on a project called End-to-End Trust, which seeks to make the internet safer and more trusted. This obviously can't be done overnight. There's 3 key pillars of this kind of work. Security and privacy fundamentals, that includes everything from standards for development and guidelines around privacy. Technical innovations is the second. It focuses on a trusted stack rooted in hardware, very important to anchor trust at the lowest possible level. And something really that speaks to what Luis mentioned at the beginning of the event, which was social, economic, political, and IT alignment. It's this multidisciplinary, multi-domain problem that you can't get ecosystem change to happen unless you get alignment of those 4 things. And I'd say that, the way I view this kind of space isn't all around defense. It's really about enabling new scenarios that enable people to tap and businesses to tap the benefits of all these wonderful data flows, while at the same time protecting personal freedoms. So there's definitely a yin-yang going on there. And the last thing I'd mention is when looking at all the threats that are before us, we've heard a number of different aspects to them already, but just being able to tease out the difference between, say, cybercrime, military espionage, or economic espionage, and cyber warfare is very critical, because how you decide to go and actually address those problems might be very different. The tools you'll use will be different, although the vectors and the mechanisms being used might be very similar in terms of the attack.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Kaiser, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance. And I work in an organization, we're a nonprofit organization, that is a public-private partnership. And so those of you who know anything or a little bit about cybersecurity know that when people talk about solving some of the cybersecurity problems, they talk about public-private partnerships. What we focus on mostly is education and awareness. We like to think of it sometimes as, in the United States, and it's certainly bigger globally, as the 300 million eyeball problem. Right? How do we get everybody who's touching this technology to use it safely, securely, ethically, and also productively? It's not just about, just being able to use it. It's about using it for good as well. So a couple of things I think that have been said here that I already agree with and I think are really important. I love the fact that you've changed it from security of the internet to the future of the internet, because I actually think that's the way we look at this, and similar to what Jeffrey was saying. The future, if we have a secure internet, our future is basically unlimited. And so how we use this platform, how we secure it so that people can communicate can share content, can create communities, is really critical, and security underlies that. So we look at security not so much as it obviously has a level of protection against bad things. That's very, very important. But we look at security as an enabler, right? It enables us, when you have a trusted platform where people can conduct activities in a way that they trust, even people who they don't know across the globe, you have a whole different kind of platform. So the kinds of things I'd like people to think about a little bit more are how do we raise a whole global generation of people and educate them to engage in this technology productively, ethically, safely, and securely? How do we promote the development of information sharing and new technologies that will secure this very valuable asset? And a lot of words get tossed around here. One of them, Jeffrey just said, was ecosystem, and we very much take an ecosystem approach to security. I really believe the internet in some ways is a natural resource. I know that sounds strange, but it is. It's something where we have an impact wherever we touch the technology, and wherever we touch it, we're impacting the technology across the globe. So I'll leave it at that.
Right. Well, there's nothing left to be said, I guess. After So yeah, my name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the Chief of Research at the Markle Foundation. And the Markle Foundation works to accelerate the use of information technology to address critical public needs. And so that's where we ultimately decided to also touch on cybersecurity, because the more society relies on information technology, the more cybersecurity becomes an issue. And I think that's really why I guess we should care about cybersecurity. I have to say that having been on a variety of panels, that quite often you have those two paradigms, and I just want to, because it's the start of the panel, I just want to put those two paradigms at the table, and we can tease them, and it really was mentioned to a certain extent. One paradigm is what John started with, which is the paradigm of the cyber attack, which could have major implications, right? You have this whole cyber Pearl Harbor kind of narrative that is being created with regard to cyber weapons, which basically is a very valid debate to be had, but it's a debate which is different than the cybersecurity issues that were mentioned quite often, because it's a debate about offensive capabilities. And from my perception, that is a debate that is still probably, because quite often it gets, anyway, most of the attention, it's a debate that is important, but it has achieved too much attention from my point of view, because I still believe that there are actually not that many players out there that actually can provide for the offensive capabilities. And also, quite often, those capabilities are actually less technical and more in the area of intelligence to be able to go about. So that's a whole different debate. The other debate is really which sometimes gets less attention, is the debate of, which I call cyber erosion, which is the so-called death by 1,000 cuts, which is indeed, while cybersecurity quite often doesn't get the attention, it's happening every day. And here we have two core components, which again needs to be teased apart. One component is cybercrime, and clearly there is a law enforcement component, and how you go about that is a very challenging perspective from mainly from a forensics and corporation point of view. The other one, which has become more important, is this whole aspect of cyber espionage, especially cyber espionage commercial-wise. And that relates actually with the panel that we had here just before lunch, which is the panel on innovation. Because cyber espionage and innovation don't go together to a certain extent. Because if you innovate and then you have actually the day after you have innovated, the innovation is being stolen and replicated all over the world, then you have an economic security problem. And from my point of view, the economic security paradigm is one that hasn't received enough attention in the cybersecurity debate, and is going to become more and more important, especially given the emphasis on innovation to get out of the economic recession. And I think that's an area that anyway, perhaps we can
No,
address further.
Stephen, I appreciate that framing. I think you're getting at something that's important that we should focus on. But one of the things I'd like to come back to is the narrative of the offensive attack, because that's a justification for a very new governance model, the ITU debate of those who are saying that you should govern the internet, and then who's saying that, what's the real story there. And is that really going to provide security? The models of governance where you're going to have the ability to clamp down, is it warranted given the nature of the attack? Because you had legislation in the U.S., and now you may have, potentially have a executive order, we're told, about this. And that could have really strong implications. There is the danger that you're going to take yesterday's regulatory structures and frameworks and apply it to a current technology, be mostly inappropriate, and yet there's a lot of pressure to do that. And I would like to have some commentary about what, given there is this momentum to deal with the issue, because you're going to attack critical infrastructure, there's a certain fear being generated in these scenarios around that. So how do we sort of, one, do you consider that the threat that great? And two, if it is, what should be the response? We talk about public-private partnerships. How would that really work in something as fluid and complex as this? And because the attempts to do that have not been terribly successful. But so, the Admiral, I would like to have, if you could lead off on that. We can tee off on
Yeah, get the government guy up here. Okay.
The guy with the stripes. Easy target.
This is probably the biggest question around this. I mean, let's look at it. Do you realize that from a telecommunications service priority standpoint, the internet is considered an entertainment network? It is. In other words, for landlines and all these other pieces, there's a group, the National Communication System, that manages that can bring and set priorities nationally in event of a disaster of which circuits you bring back up first because of its criticality to operations of the network. But that authority to be able to take and do that regulatory oversight, going back to the breakup of the Baby Bells, is that this entertainment network was hands-off. Okay, so there's pieces there, but at the same time, in an environment of the desire for less regulatory, and this is probably one of the reasons why that the current bill, sponsored by several senators and congressmen, has recently reached a stalemate, because it's the argument over how regulatory can it be. And I think we're going to have to move to some different, we're going to have to think about the internet differently. And we're going to have to think about these networks differently, and it's new frameworks, maybe the regulatory frameworks of the willing, consortiums that are brought together, much like we do with IMO and these types of things, where you bring the willing together to establish standards from a voluntary standpoint, not that you will. But again, you're going to differentiate. If you meet the standards and say you're a service provider on the internet, or that you're a Google and those types of things, and so you say, hey, I meet those standards voluntarily, by the way, your product is probably better sellable, or is at least better acceptable by those in the field. So I think it's going to be a blending of a lot of different things. This is just too complex, and not only that, it's not just the United States, it's worldwide. And how difficult is it to bring worldwide groups together to come to these types of agreements? And again, the moment that you make them compulsory, that's when you start getting, like we discussed in the previous panel, it takes years, 4, 5, 6 years to build something that you can present in an international plenary that is indeed, it's actual restrictive on the government. You will meet this.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that, because I've been in a number of sessions with various folks from DoD, and they're talking about having a resilient network, being invested in a resilient network. And so there are things that make sense from a public policy point of view that don't make sense from a company corporate investment point of view. So do you really think that you can do something on a voluntary basis in order to achieve the resilience, the security, And if there is this question of protecting core infrastructure like that, I mean, is it going to happen fast enough on that basis? And you maybe want to respond to that too.
Well, yeah, I mean, I once wrote a book on self-governance, and my only conclusion after writing that book was that self-governance only works if there is a shadow of government. And by which I mean is that quite often the only incentive to actually get to the level of security, in that case, security that you want to have, you need to have an active role of government. And whether they say we're going to step in or whether they step in. But without that push and of course also the commercial incentive to actually do what is necessary, without that push, self-governance quite often doesn't work that well. And that also quite often applies to all kinds of voluntary standards that you hope to establish.
But then, if that may apply on a national standard, but does that apply globally? Does that then imply that the shadow government is the ITU, or is that,
well, don't get me started on the ITU. But well, clearly, clearly, let's first of all, it seems like we are having a debate at different levels here. But there is clearly a need for international cooperation and collaboration in this area, given the fact that the unique feature of the internet is that it's borderless. Of course, there are all debates to what extent you can actually have a fragmented internet and so on. And so you need to have certain international collaboration, cooperation, and so on. And the question, of course, is, well, does that mean that you need to have one single governance institution ruling the internet? Well, obviously not, because what you will have is what I call a distributed governance approach, is that you're going to have different actors dealing with different parts of actually the internet, and one part will be dealing with offensive capabilities. And what is needed there is, for instance, a warning system, or at least a system that if there is an attack, and there is a hunch that the attack might come from a country, that at least there is, before there is a counterattack, that at least there is some kind of a dialogue or an act or responsibility to assist to figure out where the attack really came from. Because anyway, we're not going to go to the attribution. So that's one element of international cooperation. Is that the ITU? Obviously not, right? So because that's clearly a national security environment. And then we have, needs with regard to information sharing. We have needs with regard to collaboration among law enforcement, and so on and so on. So I would say, the ITU would only touch on a small part, and probably needs to touch on a small part of that debate, which is mainly, in my point of view, a standard setting.
And where were these other organizations surface? Where would they come from?
Well, that's the big debate, right? That's the big debate where they should go. For instance, the G8 has a long-standing collaboration on security. What about the Council of Europe, who has this cybercrime treaty that somehow gets ignored in the debate, and so on and so on. So it is a debate that is not finalized, but it's a far more complex environment, which will lead to a distributed governance environment, which will have different governance entities basically doing different things.
Eden?
Yeah, I wanted to mention, I've had experience with how international efforts to create central discussions have actually caused some problems because of it being a center of power and different interests trying to carve out their needs once there's a bottleneck somewhere where power and control can be used. It's attracted to different parties. The Council of Europe actually has done as good a job as any, but Europe itself, I think, supports something Michelle already said about different values and ethics. And you have different countries using cybercrime. I was very involved in Thailand, where they were using the cybercrime legislation to go after any opponents who might have who said something demeaning to the king, lèse majesté. And it was, it was under the cybercrime statute that was passed, though there were other connected laws that should have been passed but weren't, including data protection. But in Thailand, it was clear the way that the values and ethics of the society, which, especially if manipulated by people in power, could turn these structures that would allow some control over cybercrime or being able to investigate it into a means of going after political enemies, et cetera. So the example there was someone who had a website, a bulletin board chat room. There was someone on there, one of the millions of Thai kids who wrote on it and said in metaphor something that might have been insulting to the king, and it was actually their Ministry of Information that went to shut down this site. The point being that in coming up with international standards that are not a matter of technical standards, that are a matter of moral standards, it's difficult to come upon that. To note, Europe, which until recently was an example of how you can unite countries in a union that will be everlasting. It's notable that the last part of integration is criminal law. I mean, that's the part where each country is left to its own set of traditions and customs and laws to figure that out.
Well, let me follow up on that a little bit, because you made an earlier reference to something about architecture, and I remember Vin Cerf, who's one of the founders of the internet, and was saying that the one thing they regretted he didn't do was they didn't put an authentication layer, and so it was sort of spun up. Now, do you see there being a need for a new architecture, and when you start to architect this you're starting to define certain kinds of institutional freedoms or lack of freedoms, and basically how that's designed? I mean, do you see that movement? Do you think that's an important consideration?
I think it is an important one, but I unfortunately disagree with authentication being a fundamental part, a word that hasn't come up yet here, the value of anonymity. There's a lot of value to being able to speak anonymously, which is possible through the internet. It is also the way that people are able to commit criminal acts and evade being chased after. But we see the extent to which anonymity itself can create security. For example, in the other context, the economic, the business espionage. It was actually the city of Vienna that established a Tor node in their Chamber of Commerce, realizing that the businesses, in the local businesses, had uses for being able to have invisible or hard to reach traffic, which required a certain degree of anonymity to protect their assets economically. So I would throw anonymity in there as a very difficult problem to architect in.
Well, we have someone who's an architect of trust at Microsoft, and end-to-end trust. And I know we've been on a number of panels and the councils together around World Economic Forum and Jeffrey. So I'll just
offer this up. I think whenever you're designing systems or ecosystems, it helps to have some high-level principles of what it is you're trying to achieve. And some of the design principles are around a continuum of identity, or identifiability is more accurately the way you would say that, all the way from being fully anonymous to fully identified. Yes. I mean, clearly to protect personal freedoms and freedom of expression, anonymity has a wonderful role to play, an important role to play. Conversely, if you're trying to get into a nuclear power plant, I don't think the person should be anonymous. And so there's this, I'm not saying you were suggesting that.
I was not.
I know you weren't. So there's this whole continuum of addressing risk fundamentally and having different levels of assurance based on the situation and the context. So any system that we come up with should have a full representation of all these different expressions of identifiability for the right context in the right moment.
John, there's a piece of information missing. I think that we should not assume that the audience knows the urgency of what's happening at the ITU right now. and this year. And so someone should just give 20 seconds on what that is, because I think the panelists have an advantage as to information.
Does anyone want to summarize? I can make
Yeah,
it.
it's just 20 seconds. I think it'll be enough.
I mean, there is a move, and the ITU is an International Telecommunications Union, and there's actually a vote that's coming up on this. And when is the vote?
December 20th.
It's December 20th. And that is to give the ITU the right to have some kind of governance over the internet. And that has far-ranging implications, and the pretext for it is the issue of cybersecurity, and it's being advocated strongly by Russia and China, and so one can see it as not necessarily a pretext for it could be easily captured by countries and governments to want to use it as a way of closing it down. And actually there are those commercial interests to see it's a way of actually going back in time and being able to have charge over, see, you have new kind of tariffs that can come out of it. So but the driver and the legitimation for this claim is this a cybersecurity issue. If you want to add anything to that,
No, yeah, and I mean, this is a long-standing debate. Basically, it's quite often also framed as a debate between ICANN on the one hand and the ITU on the other hand. ICANN being the Internet Corporation for Assigned Numbers and Names, who oversees the assignment of domain names, but was created in the U.S. and is still based in the U.S. and is basically seen by Russia and China and others as an American governance institution that governs a global infrastructure such as the internet. And so because of that concern and because of the frustration they have with ICANN, they've tried to promote the ITU, which is the oldest UN agency, to actually become more active on internet-related issues. And basically, it's a technical debate, but basically what they try to do this fall and winter is to re-engineer and reform the mandate of the ITU, which would include the internet or information communications technologies as part of the mandate. And then, of course, the question is, if they have the mandate, what will they take on, and so on and so on. But it's, from my point of view, it's unlikely that this will happen, given the fact that several, including the US, have actually already made their point clear that they don't want to have the ITU move into those directions. And then you have others saying, well, guess what? The ITU already has the mandate to go into that debate. So quite often, it's a little bit of a geopolitical
But that last point is very important. That was a little more color. So the vote is happening, if I'm not mistaken, in Dubai. The chairman and host of that session is the Minister of Telecommunications for the UAE, with whom I sit on the Global Agenda Council for the Future of the Internet. Very interesting guy, very smart guy. What's happened in this moment of globalization, which we celebrate as Internetians, Internet people, is that you have, for the first time, enough weight outside of the West, which means the United States, okay, to actually bring this kind of issue to a head with a lot of the West versus the rest of the world aligning together, saying it's enough of the hegemony of the United States, basically the US, / sort of Europe, something, the United States. It's enough of the hegemony of the ICANN, of the United States government, of the United States companies whom the rest perceive to be in cahoots with the United States government, which I think is largely bunk, and are trying now to offer a very different view of governance of the internet, which will be by the way, at the pipe layer, like at the root and pipe layer. And the Gulf states, given what's going on in the last couple of years, have a very different set of incentives from other countries right now to make sure that their people and their populations are not behaving in certain ways. Now, here's what I think is going to happen, because I think that you offered a very correct prognosis that this is, what is feared to go down is not wholly going to go down. It never goes down that way. But here's what could go down. You're going to see new and different modes of governance from very central command kind of authorities from outside the United States governing their pipes and infrastructure a lot more aggressively. The West will continue to behave more openly. And the workaround, the good news, and I think there's always good news on the internet because the internet's a self-healing instrument for the most part, is that there's new architecture coming out of CNAS and other places that will, I think, offer a set of Internet 2 and Internet 3s that may have different mechanisms for sharing communication information in a way that I think we would recognize as better and progressive for most uses. So the good news is that no matter what happens, I think there will be a workaround. The bad news is this just may raise costs a lot. So we may need new pipe. We may need all the different things. I am actually very optimistic about what's happening here in the United States in terms of the reasonably slow government, but now accelerating government process adapting to the risks. To your matrix, though, I'd offer only one addition. I think you leave out, you offer, Stefan, cybercrime and cyber espionage. You may fold into cyber espionage the concept of cyber terror. Yeah. I don't. Let me tell you why I don't. I think cybercrime is actually largely being solved. Please just emphasize that I did say the word largely being solved. It's on the mend. Cyber espionage, big problem, especially commercial espionage, big problem. Cyber terror, different category to me because you have everything from kind of like a kid who wants to bring down the Saudi stock exchange website, and that kid may or may not be Israeli, but it's certainly not the Israelis who are doing it, because if the Israeli government doing it, it'd be a lot more than the website, right? That's the kind of like self-appointed state-sponsored terror, right, which has nothing to do with the state. Someone a few weeks ago, right, brought down massive and critical infrastructure at Saudi Aramco, which, as I read it, irrespective of your opinion of Saudi Aramco, irrespective of your opinion of oil as a business and the hegemony of oil as a business, this is an attack on the global economy. Saudi Aramco is responsible for enormous production of oil, sends to the United States. The United States economy is $13–14 trillion. If oil stops, the economy slows down. Everybody suffers. I don't care where you are. Even if you're against the United States, your economy suffers too. So this kind of cyber terror, which is setting aside a Stuxnet, which feels a little more state-sponsored, this kind of cyber terror can, by the way, begin in the morning as a prank and end the evening as real problems. We know that the FAA has been infiltrated. We know that it's happened. They announced it, and it is time for us to get very, very serious about that question of cyber terror, which may not have commercial interests in mind, which I think is omitted from your espionage and criminal categories. There may be kind of a nationalism at play and so forth. I just see more and more incidences of kind of college-age kinds of types or a little older, a little younger, who believe that they're acting in the best interest of their country by attacking someone else in another place. And even their home country does not want that to happen. I consider that cyber terror. That would be a third part of your matrix.
I would just like to add something. I think it's not only, I think the challenge is not that they think they're acting in their own interests of their country. It's that they're acting in their interests globally, and they're aligning outside of countries, right? I mean, the internet changes a lot of things, right? And it also changes your ability to act as a citizen in alignment with other people who share your values, no matter where they live. Right? So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to do this because the United States government won't go after this country which is doing bad things. I'm going to go after them for the United States government. It's people around the world collectively saying, we don't like these guys, right? And it doesn't matter where you live. We just don't like these guys, and we're going to go after them. Well, that changes the dynamic, right? That changes all these government institutions are not prepared to respond right now to that kind of activity, because everything is around government to government and those kinds of things. This is a new world, and I think thinking about the governance structure itself, I think we need new institutions. We need new ways of doing this. I think there are some examples. They're very small, of groups that have come together. I mean, I'll give you one, which is in Pittsburgh, the NCFTA, which is working on cybercrime issues, which is a trusted third party in between government and industry. Well, and they need to be there because they need to share information, and there are too many rules about how government and industry can share information. But if somebody can come in the middle, scrub data, share it in a way that's that satisfies the needs of both sides and gets the job done, those are the kinds of institutions we need going forward, instead of fighting over the old school institutions, which are just trying to claim a piece of the pie in the new world.
I think that's a really great point. I mean, and ICON was sort of a first generation, but then okay. So and the question of legitimacy of those institutions and being able to enforce something is that how and do you have any ideas what that might be? I mean, and I'll ask the Admiral. I mean, these seem to be things that would be on your plate and how to do these kind of things.
Well, sure. This has been objective right from the get-go with just the Department of Homeland Security.
Right.
They took and they built this multi-million-dollar facility called the NCCIC, which was supposed to be a consortium of public, private, all brought together to provide situational awareness across multiple different avenues of our country, be it critical infrastructure, be it banking, be it electrical, the whole 9 yards, and to be a clearinghouse to share information. But it fell back on again
Right.
is the legal piece. And not only that, a risk-based piece from some of the companies saying, if I just got hit by something, which Bank of America did yesterday, and as well as Citi, again, it looked like one of those loose group of affiliations, just a pure denial of service attack. But sharing that information and it comes public that you were being hurt, your stock price goes down.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
And there's
get
got to
at.
be something set up, such that we can take and, as we say, wash the source, but at the same time share the information such that if you got it, maybe I'm going to get it too. And so this seems to be the legal piece. It's the most difficult. And the whole concept of build it and they will come, some have come. I mean, many companies have come to the NCCIC and are doing great stuff. But there are the key ones out there like, this
Yeah.
is government, I want nothing to do with
Yeah,
it.
right. But just to follow up, though, so you said the legal piece. Could you clarify on sort of what the legal issues are, liability issues, or what? And maybe Michelle, you would like to comment on that as well.
Well, it's a bunch of them. It's a liability issue. It's also the fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders in some cases in companies. So it goes across a whole legal spectrum. And what happens if you did not meet NIST standards for one part of your network? Does your stockholder say, hey, you weren't running the company right, let's come after them?
Well, there is, an NSTIC, with the National Strategy Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, it's a mouthful. There is this idea of trying to get safe harbor provisions at some point. And if you were able to set up safe harbor provisions of best practices, then be able to get relief from those liabilities, is that something that you see is being viable?
That's where I'm trying to go, because again, I'm trying to come in with a non-regulatory authority that's saying, here are the best practices. Here's the best practices from Carnegie. Here's the best practices from companies like McAfee and Symantec. Here's best practices that federal government has learned. I'm not going to check you on them, but if you would like me to, voluntarily we'll come in, take a look, and here's a list of things we recommend. These are best practices, we walk away. And I think that is the beginning piece. And at least with my partners in the maritime critical infrastructure world, that's where I'm trying to lead them to. Even though in the physical world, from the Maritime Transportation Safety Act of 2001, I have a physical stick. If their fence is not fixed, I can go in and sanction them. But the worst threat they've got is probably that DS3 circuit that's running into the facility versus the physical fence.
Right. Michelle, yes.
Yeah, there's a multiplicity of factors here, and some of the kind of best of bad situations is a safe harbor, which basically every time you have a safe harbor, you kind of almost admit that you're doing something that might be fudgy, right? Whether to another government or to a citizen or to a consumer. So safe harbors are great, and we certainly advocate for them for these information sharing. A lot of what we do as a security company, we're in that special position where we do a lot of sharing. It's the function. So when you come to us and when you buy our products, you're buying them for security protection. So we kind of have a built-in safe harbor, if you will. But the same issues apply to the major mega retailers who know more about intentionality than we do, that probably know more than the telcos know, and they're highly, highly regulated. The data that is most valuable to protect our nations and our smaller communities and our families is personal, and that's the problem, because you have this kind of trifecta of data. My out right now is to cleanse it and make it all anonymous, but the reality is for real threats, and I mean real is a fudgy term too, right? So is it real because someone's going to die? Is it real because someone's going to tunnel in? Is it real because there's economic harm, and to whom? And so you have to put all of those factors together when there's no one clean solution here.
But isn't it, NSTIC, that they're trying to move that way and looking at fair information practices and principles and providing certain kind of relief and recognizing that.
Yeah.
And I mean, is that a viable alternative? Because if that isn't, then are you really going to get legislation at that? And that is not going to happen. We all know that.
So just a commentary on I think NSTIC is a good way to go. I think there's a huge citizen party missing at NSTIC, right?
Oh, yes, very much.
It's the people who actually use
Yes.
their credit cards and don't think
Yeah.
they're being tracked. It's the people that
Yes.
use the phones
Yeah.
and leave the geolocation on, and they don't really understand the context
Yeah,
and the
very
weight
much so.
of data, either on the asset side of the equation, and with what Michael's trying to do, or with the risk side of the equation.
Absolutely. Jeffrey?
So, this brings up this other whole related topic, which is data flows and personal data flows, and being able to control those better, and
Yes.
empowering people with tools to do that.
Yes.
And along with a mental model where they understand what's happening,
Yes.
so they don't make silly mistakes.
Yes.
All of this
Keep
is
going.
very critical. And if we're to, NSTIC is a stepping stone towards those kinds of things, because it starts to articulate some of the principles that start to resonate with people. But at the end of the day, you still need the ability for the average person to be able to, manage their own flows. And you'd like to have the potential right, so to speak,
Yep.
to use it for national protections, when it's clean enough, right? And that you're allowed to do it. Because right now, we're more blind on the situational awareness, and that's so critical, so we know.
But a lot of the debate, this is great. I love that you brought this up again, because I had a read of the panel that we were deep into deep national security, cybersecurity stuff, which is wonderful, but I like talking about privacy as well. I'm glad you brought it back to this. These are connected topics. Often, perhaps too often, the discussion about threat to individuals on the internet focuses on threats from government and intrusions from government. That is a function partly of the correct set of observations, correctly and justly made, about how much of the world still functions as a matter of government and intrusion. I believe it is also partly true because the power the generation that remains in power in places like DC are still a generation of civil rights activists and their immediate successors. I'm 33. My generation, I think, worries, at least in respect of the West, more about the proliferation of little brothers than the threat of big brother from the West. I don't think that I am unique in my perspective. I also know that there are others who are quite worried about the Western governments, and that's quite understandable. I'm not going to dismiss that set of concerns. I'm instead going to focus in this comment on little brothers very quickly. And there is a huge flow of information that is collected without knowledge or consent about individuals by companies every day, that is used for purposes that nobody here can identify, with consequences that we cannot still yet fully articulate. Specific example would be a change in your health insurance premiums without your knowledge or permission or consent, and you have no visibility into the fact that there was a change, or the cause of the change. So this is a very, very important set of things that may or may not be enabled by an NSTIC or comparable technologies. But I'm very glad that we raised this, because it's such an important part of this security spectrum.
Can I make a quick comment?
Yes,
so I
please.
think you picked a really good example that everyone goes to, which is the insurance premium. We do have existing laws that prohibit that behavior. That behavior is illegal on the part of the insurance companies today. The problem is we don't have the transparency of the flows, so that it probably does happen in a very pernicious fashion. It's not like the Fair Credit and Reporting Act. We have a right to see how an employer or other commercial business has made a decision about your credit or your employability, for example. So it happens, but it's illegal. But even the source that has made this decision about you may not know exactly why and what the origin is. And I want to make one more quick point, that just to balance all of this. So there are also these kind of citizen protections, I call them. So there's a great app, it's called Wicker, W-I-C-R, and it basically allows you to set up an anonymized account. So you can send encrypted emails, pictures, and voicemail to each other. It was developed by a good buddy of mine who actually wanted this for her kids, so that they could text her the schedules and say, come pick me up after ski practice, or look at me, she's a competitive skier, I just did X. And so her intention is to support unobserved traffic and man-in-the-middle attacks against her family. Now, if that technology is deployed worldwide, well, what am I going to give to the Rear Admiral when he comes calling? Yes, right.
Well, this gets to the question of architecture. I mean, obviously, and how do you because I think technically there's ways in which you can accommodate both. I mean, there's a third way that Michael is alluding to, and that you can get into the weeds of what that technology would look like and architecture look like. But I think there is a way. But one thing I'd like that people comment on is that. Michael makes the point that people are worried about little brothers, but yet you have the Facebook phenomenon. You have and the efforts to get Facebook to have a comprehensible privacy policy, accountable privacy policy. Same thing with Google. I mean, there's a real resistance because there's a cost associated with it. They want to bring out as much information as they possibly can about people. That's their business model. So, I mean, how do you reconcile that? I mean, are there going to be alternative architectures that create different business models that are going to outcompete that model? Or, I mean, this is before the whole panel, but I like to sort of throw that out. And
well, I think really relevant, and given that safe harbor was proposed in regards to international negotiations on privacy, you see between Europe and the U.S. a stalemate that really just can never resolve itself. In particular, we have a safe harbor if a company is abiding by European data protection laws, which is self-reporting. You just put yourself on a website, your name's there, and then you're covered. And the EU, if they want to do something about it, they have to go through the FTC. One thing that's different about, and this is the architecture answer, one thing that's different about the data protection laws than our fair information practices is the notion of access by the user of information about them.
Yes.
This is the one thing that's the missing piece. That's the one thing that they have in Europe that is regulated, that is not here, and that's also, it also happens to be one of the reasons that American internet companies have been able to be much more successful using advertising and personal data than European companies.
Okay, we'll switch. We'll go to the floor.
I mean, so the real issue with privacy quite often is anyway, it's again one of those muddled debates. And from my perception, the real issue with privacy is how is your information being handled, right? This is not about some elusive right. It's really about how is your information being handled. And until now, the whole concept, of course, which was already mentioned by Eden, was the fair information practices, right? A set of practices and principles that determine how personal information should be handled by the company or the government that collects the information. And there were a whole set of principles ranging from you only collect for the purpose that was specified at the origin of collection, and so on and so on. Now, those FIPS, right, now have become popular also within the White House and within the FTC. The unfortunate element with the FIPS is that they are 30 years old, and that we have now an environment where you indeed, as was mentioned, where indeed purpose specification does not stand up anymore. I mean, there is no, in an environment where your data shadow is everywhere and where you have a set of collectors of that data on an ongoing basis, there is no way to actually enforce the FIPS anymore because there is no purpose specification anymore. And that's the whole concept of the business model quite often of Facebook, is that we want to collect the information, but we don't know yet what the purpose might be, because the business model is that we want to keep it open, and hence the whole model of the FIPS basically collapsed. So from my perception, we are at a time where innovation on privacy is highly needed. Because the old regime, whether it's FIPS or whether it's de-identification, I'm not even going to start on de-identification, does not stand anymore at a time of big data. And so that's the real problem in privacy from my point of view.
Great. Now I'd like to just add...
Well, we'll end with you, and then we'll open it for questions.
Okay. Just to add one more thing about the other gaps within FIPS. You mentioned big data, and also this the whole collection of sensor data. And it's just almost impossible to have a consent experience when you have all these sensors everywhere.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah.
But even if you did have a consent experience, the ability for users to understand what that means and have an effective model of where they're actually participating in that decision, the informed part, has just failed miserably. So that as we're going to redo FIPS or revisit FIPS, these are the critical areas that need to be revisited, and the notice of consent regime.
I would argue that I mean, I totally agree with the notice. You have so many pop-ups, you go nuts, right? I mean, but the idea of a trust framework and a brand associated with the trust framework and how to enforce that, I think there is a way out, I would argue.
John, keep going. So say some more about that, because you're an expert.
I'm like reputation. But,
if you must talk about my company in depth, I won't stop you. But you also have your own point of view. You have your own projects on this. So without referring
we're developing open source software that basically and deals with a lot of very complex permissions and location-based information, time information. It's complex in the sense that you don't actually share physically the data. You run queries inside distributed data stores and it's encrypted. So there are a lot of techniques that you can do, and that you basically then you have a trust framework, where there's a set of private legal agreements that are binding, and people want to innovate in that. So I think this is where it goes back to the earlier session on innovation. I think there's innovation, legal and technology, institutional innovation is required here. It's that, and it's how to assemble a lot of different technologies in order to run these experiments. And I think we're at the edge of doing some of these things in a very interesting way. But I do want to, we only have about 5 minutes, so I do want to open it up to the audience, and we have whoever has the mic has several questions.
Hi, my name is Linda Caro, and cyber terrorism kind of brought up in my mind cyber warfare. And what I mean by that is, in today's world, we have a lot of proxy warfare going on. And what comes up is Stratfor hack, okay, where a third party actually got into Stratfor's database, and they have 1 million clients who are related to Intel in one way or another, whether they're retired, active, government clients, business clients, unrelated to Intel, but everybody was in that pot, and it was hacked by the jokers or whomever they are, I don't know. But it's proxy. You could have, there could have been Iran doing proxy warfare against the United States when we were about, there was a lot of rhetoric about attacking Iran at the time, and they could have a proxy warfare to say, let's get a lot of fuss in here.
What is your question then? Was the question being? Because we were trying to...
Well, I wanted to bring it out. I don't understand really why a lot of companies like that don't put things behind the DMZ.
Okay.
You know, everything's out in the open.
I'll just say what I said at the beginning. Privacy and security fundamentals. It's the #1 thing you got to do.
Yeah, you can do that. It's something pretty obvious.
Well, also depending on
Defense in depth.
depending on the information being saved by some closed door, and then everything's in there. Once the door is open, the bad guys have it. Just like there was a famous quote about the French wide boulevards in Paris made it much easier to travel in. It also made it much easier to attack once you get in. And the same thing if things are built in such a way that they're efficient, but there's kind of some closed doors that are what all the security depends on, being flipped the other way can be disaster, which is why I support a more open model.
I'll give you my pragmatic, cynical view on the thing as well. Companies don't need to report when they're reporting their financials, at least publicly held companies don't need to report how good they are on these terms. And until they do, the chief executive officer who is making the decisions about budget, about growth, about where you're going to spend, the customers are never rising up and saying, Amazon, give me more security. They're saying, Amazon, give me more stuff.
Yeah. Can I just add one quick thing to this? I think we always have to take a time frame approach here, right? And we have to look at things, the internet, from my perspective, is, 1996. That's when high-speed internet started to become available to the general public, right? Before that, we didn't have a lot of these problems, really. I mean, they weren't. Well, you can't operate a business in this country without putting exit signs by emergency exits or out having emergency lights in certain places. It takes years, decades, for those kinds of practices to come into place to be a norm, right? And I think we have to look at it this way a little bit, right? We are evolving towards those things. We have people like over here who are building better technology all the time, right? But, cars still get in accidents and people die in them. It's been around 100 years. We have to take the time
Michael,
frame.
I think what you're saying is very important, but I think you're not meaning to be flip. I would never suggest that. But
I'm
I think
not meaning to be flip.
No, but I think accidentally you're being flip. And the reason I think that is that I think your analogy is intended to be good, but it suffers from a key flaw, which is that the cars have not become rocket ships, have not become speed of light travel in the space of 10 years. And the problem set in our space, in our field, is advancing much more rapidly, and therefore the solutions must also gallop apace much more rapidly. And so I think you're a sophisticated person, you know how to fill in, but would you fill in the gap? Because I think that there's a gap you're making.
Well, I think the technology has moved at rocket speed in terms of security, right? I think a lot of these things are, 1,000 times better than they were 10 years ago. I think it is. I actually think the platform is moving at the same speed across.
Okay,
but the point is this, though. The point is this: right. to have a culture, right, which has dealt with all these safety and security issues, is slower than the technology.
Okay, the norms. I'm with you on the norms. As to the facts, though, I think I'm not with you, because
that's
the amount of, I think the cybersecurity industry has consistently failed to keep pace. The amount of money lost to cyber threat every year has grown every year for the last 20 years. And so by the most important measure that we can easily measure, the industry is failing.
So let me just offer one little piece up here.
I want to get some more questions.
Let me just wrap on this. I was a little flip when I said security privacy fundamentals. There actually is a lot of emerging new technology and techniques for making data more secure.
Yes.
One of the whole paradigm shifts is moving the boundary of security to the data itself, rather than at the DMZ like you were talking about. It's actually a major change where data actually becomes a trusted data blob, where you've got the data plus some metadata that tells you what the policy is, and they travel together. So no matter what trust boundary it crosses, it's still honored. You wouldn't have those kind of breaches as much as you hear about them today.
Yep.
Okay, one more question, then we're going to,
John Allen. What is the probability that we'll have a major cyber event over the next 10 years, which I define is impacting at least 100 million people for at least 1 week? And then the other very simple question is, will the internet be taxed? And if so, how and who will be the beneficiary?
100 million. I don't know that one hasn't happened already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
100%. And in fact, within the last several months. You just didn't know.
As to tax, wow.
Well, just think about GoDaddy, right? And now it didn't last a week, but GoDaddy went down for, 24, 48 hours. And think about how many small businesses in this country depend upon.
That's what I say, a week.
Yeah. But there's a lot of examples like that. I mean, that was just last week's flavor.
Well,
We're gonna see
but
more.
it shows the complexity. Meaning, one of the elements that is so complex on cybersecurity is the total absence of clarity and transparency. And part of that is indeed the fact that, for instance, the companies don't disclose, right? Especially in a cyber espionage environment, there is no disclosure to a certain extent, and for a variety of reasons. And so, because, right, there is a lack of that transparency, there is this muddled debate whether actually we should lay awake at night for a cyber Pearl Harbor, right, which is again one of those overblown, to a certain extent, quite often threats. I mean, it's real, but anyway, how do you gauge that, right? And I think we need to have a more public debate about the real threat, and we need to have more valid data about what is indeed the loss in order to have then actually policy action to take place. Because part of the reason why there is no policy action is because there is no enough evidence to really bring them over the table to actually start acting, right? And that's part of the challenge that we have right now.
How about the taxes?
That's a scary one to go to. I'll let you finish, and I got one more.
There are different layers to the internet, and some of them are depending on your.
So I think it is let me turn this into a humorous answer. I think it is the objective of most internet companies to handle the threat of tax by continuing to lose money as fast as possible for as long as possible, thereby avoiding tax.
Who does that include?
And I get this one last piece. How many people, when we had the swine flu epidemic a couple of years ago, got the inoculation? Quite a few people. How many people are inoculating themselves against this type of threat?
Not enough.
It's an ecosystem.
But to say, the threat is real, and these things do happen. We're also in tandem recovering better.
Yeah.
So we're learning how to recover faster. We're learning how to be a lot more resilient than we were as well. So is it keeping pace with the threats? Never, because you have one guy who can attack any opening, and we have to protect them all at once. So yes, they'll be outfoxing us. But I think that there's also an optimistic side to the answer to that question. Will there be something that will cause major downtime for over a week? I believe there will. Will it be a food supply threat that turns out to be a hoax that disrupts our food chain? Will that be the lights out for a given region of time because the grid has been taken down? These systems are eminently fragile, so
Will it be
it's really
disinformation at scale?
Disinformation, and that's what I mean about the food supply. If somebody finally tells you, like this arsenic and rice thing. Yeah. I don't know. I like sushi.
That has to the woman in the middle has to be the last statement here.
All right. I never get the last word at home.
Well, last word. There you go. There's man in the middle attack. Thank you very much.
Woman in the middle attack.